You're listening to Let Me Tell You Why You're Wrong, all on Georgia Radio Network.
Welcome to episode 69 of the Let Me Tell You Why You're Wrong podcast. I'm Jessica Salaji, your host this week. Our regular host, Dave Roberts, is not with us, but he will hopefully be back next week. But joining me this week is a friend of mine who formerly lived in South Georgia, who's going to offer a whole bunch of insight on a number of issues. James Woodall's with us. James is a Georgia native and graduate of Georgia Southern with a degree in political science and a minor in religious studies. He is also an 8-year Army veteran where he served as an intelligence analyst. He's currently enrolled at the Interdenominational Theological Center, pursuing a Master of Divinity through the Morehouse School of Religion, and he's also a resident minister in Marietta. He's been politically active. He ran for state representative in my district. I put a sign up for him in 2016. He's served on the state committee for the Georgia Democratic Party, the NAACP, and the Georgia Clients Council. He worked at the state capitol on political campaigns, and I know even though Dave's not here, we're really excited you're here. So thank you for joining us.
And thank you for having me, Jessica. I do appreciate it.
So before we dive into our show topics, something has transpired, and I did want to get your opinion on it just because we are on opposite sides of the political spectrum sometimes. But it's been all over headlines that Insurance Commissioner Jim Beck has been indicted for fraud and money laundering and other things like that. And he did step down simultaneously at the same time Kemp was pushing to remove him from office. And I think a lot of people were surprised that he was still going to collect a salary while his deputy insurance commissioner stepped up to fill the role while he was gone until this trial is the charges are sorted out. But now Kemp has appointed technically an interim insurance commissioner who is planning on running in 2020. And he is the police chief, or was the police chief, in Doraville. So what are your thoughts on that? What are your thoughts on, because now we got to pay this guy too, which is, from a fiscally conservative point, kind of grinds my gears. But what is your thought on the appointment itself?
So with the appointment of Doraville Police Chief John King, I'm not as necessarily as concerned with his appointment as an individual as much as I'm concerned with the fact that the insurance commissioner has yet to resign, and the governor has not even requested publicly that he resign, to my knowledge. And so he is still picking up on that salary, as you mentioned, and it's fiscally irresponsible for us to be paying a man's salary as he stands trial, as after he said he's not able to fulfill his obligations as a constitutional officer. So with him now being not necessarily out of office, he's more so said that he will not be able to fulfill his obligations. He's just kind of stepped to the side as this litigation process plays itself out. So we're paying him, plus we're paying the exact same amount to the new insurance commissioner or the sitting insurance commissioner, who has, by whatever way, decided that he was going to also run for insurance commissioner. It's problematic for me because of that, as well as the fact that this guy has no insurance background. He is not licensed. He hasn't taken the test or any of that. So it's just been very interesting to see this all play out. It's not as if we didn't know that this guy had problems already. And that's Jim Beck, as I'm talking about, because as the reports were, we had already known that he had some inconsistencies within reports and what have you. So this is very interesting to see how this is playing out.
I agree with just about everything you said. And, they're touting, all the news headlines are touting that it's a police chief that's assumed this role. And they were talking about the investigation aspect of fire safety, which is absolutely a role. And also one that's slightly ironic because Jim Beck, which is not related to his indictments, but he's had some speculation and some inconsistencies about an arson of his own property, I believe. But
right.
So this guy has investigatory background and skills, but the office is so much more than that. And, a police chief is running an agency, but Doraville is much different than the jurisdiction of the entire state.
Right. I personally would have wished we kind of have similar, and maybe this requires a constitutional amendment, but possibly change the Constitution to allow, in the event that a constitutional officer is not allowed to fulfill their obligations for whatever reason. I know I might get pushback on this one, but maybe open that up to a special election and let the people of Georgia decide who will be in that position, because it's a constitutional officer, and so the governor shouldn't be making political appointments in that context, but more so allowing the people of the state of Georgia to decide.
I mean, like, when you say that at face value, I'm inclined to agree, because it's so frustrating to see our elected officials get away with the things that they do, or get away with their lives minimally being impacted, especially with regard to the $120,000 salary that he's going to get for at least a year, because we know how slow the federal courts move. But also when I think about it, I'm concerned because I don't want charges to be used
right
in an inappropriate way and someone lose their job, or a rightfully won election without due process. But there has to be some sort of happy medium, because it does not seem right that, I mean, maybe even if it was 50% of his salary, like, I understand the guy has to live, but...
Well, he was the one who voluntarily, nobody coerced him into saying, hey, I'm not going to be able to fulfill my obligation. And so if, I don't know about him, but I know if I'm not able to fulfill my obligations as a private citizen, then I'm not going to still get paid. I'm going to be removed. No,
that's a very good point.
I'm going to be removed from my job.
And he didn't stay at the job to keep going with business as usual. So, I mean, that's fair. I do agree with that. But it's, most of us don't get to take a leave of absence because we're charged with a crime.
Right.
Well, it'll be interesting to see how much this ends up costing, because I'm sure there are going to be... This is one of those things where, and I'm speculating here, but this is one of those things where you end up seeing consultants brought in to help with, management and implementation of things, because the person running the office isn't
competent.
100% right. So, but moving on to our regularly scheduled programming, another story that came out this week in Georgia had to do with the state cutting Medicaid off to thousands of people. Kind of an interesting chain of events here where the stories are absolutely opposite. So basically what happened is somebody got word to the media that about 17,000 people, mostly poor, elderly, and disabled Georgians, were being cut from their Medicaid assistance because they failed to renew to the notices they received. So the AJC reported that I think it was the Department of Community Health said that they sent out the notices and never heard back. But the people, these 17,000 people, claim they never received the notices. And then I guess there's I don't know if it's pro bono, but there's a legal services group that has helped these patients. And they tried to access emails or something and found that the notices weren't sent. So, first of all, in something like this, whose side do you take?
So first, with my work that I did with the Georgia Clients Council, we partnered with Georgia Legal Services, who are representing these indigent patients, or not indigent patients, but the Medicaid and Medicare patients with legal services, and I'm siding with them because this is no excuse to remove people from access to care. And so it goes back to this question of, are we truly concerned with the poor, the least of these among us that do not have access to care? And then something as small as an email notice. Now, I get that there's processes that are in place that, allow for people to be notified that you are due for renewal. That process didn't happen. And so the fact that these citizens are still held responsible and are held to account for the failure of the system and not their own due failure is very troubling and very problematic for me. It goes back to the initial conversation about just, Medicaid expansion and those kinds of things, because the reality of it is that there is a huge gap in services rendered and people who are covered under those services, right? And so when it comes to Medicaid expansion, when it comes to healthcare access, when it comes to the Affordable Care Act, when it comes to Kemp care, all these various conversations, at the end of the day, if people are not getting care, then we have a problem. And so I'm very concerned at this, that it takes a lawyer in Georgia Legal Services. Again, I thank God for them and being in the place and position that they're doing that work. But it takes a lawyer to go in and say, hey, these people didn't get a simple email that says, hey, you're due for a renewal. And then to require them on some cases 10 days, others require 2 weeks. And then there's not a streamlined process that says what is the appeals process for people to be able to appeal that decision if they are declined care. And then what does that look like going forward? So I think we need to definitely have a conversation about this process through the legislature in the next legislative cycle, because this is just unacceptable on so many ends. And people, poor people, elderly people, disabled people in Georgia are not getting care because of a lack of failure to respond by a renewal notice that was never sent by the Department of Community Health. So I'm very concerned about that.
So I think that this kind of presents a two-pronged issue here. First, that there are people who, and I'm not saying anything to do with this article, but there are people who think that these types of benefits or services should just auto-renew, which I'm not sure, I don't think I support that. But at the same time, it seems troubling that you have to wait for the state to contact you to renew. Like, there should be a process in place where if you want to go ahead and be proactive about it, you can do that. So that if something like this were to happen, like, people would know, okay, well, I can either wait for my state notice or I can go ahead and do it myself, whether it be online or it's some sort of local or county office or one of those things. So I think that there's an inefficient system breakdown here. The other thing is 17,000 people roughly that we know of. That number is just too high to be, unless they were all last names T through Z or something. That's just, and their notices all got stuck in the vent or some odd story like that I could understand. But it's too many people to be an accident, and I don't understand why that wasn't a flag for somebody at the Department of Community Health. And then to find out that they weren't sent at all. The optics of that are terrible. And the community department has held steady in that position that, we don't, they didn't respond, instead of saying, well, there could have been a mix up or granting a waiver or whatever. Now, like you said, it has to go through the legal process. And it just seems unnecessary.
Now, to your first point about the ability to have an automatic renewal, I don't know about that one, because, like, for instance, with the tag registration, people have to go in every year on the anniversary of their birth or their birthday, right? They have to go in and do it. Some people just forget. Like, I get that there are consequences for that. There are fines and things like that. But when we're talking about people who may not have the ability to work, or they may be poor, they may be elderly, so they don't have access to the technological advances that maybe persons our age may have, right? So it may become more difficult and burdensome for them. But if they are receiving these benefits, then we must be able to articulate and to let them know, like, hey, we need you to renew every year around this time. Now, I do get that there must be a process that allows for them to do that, but give them some space to at least say, hey, I forgot, or life just caught up with me, or, I'm traveling, or those kinds of things. That accommodations are needed. But to just say automatically, if you don't renew by this time, I'm going to send you a letter and then say, we're going to decline your renewal for this next year. And so I find a little, again, it goes back to your point of, we just need to find a more efficient process. Because I know when I was in the Army, there were times like when I had to renew my TRICARE, right? Like, I would forget. And it wasn't something that literally was a life or death situation for me, because I'm, more in better health or what have you. But I can only imagine if somebody who goes to the doctor more regularly, or who needs access to those type of services, they may be so caught up in life, whatever that life may look like, that they might not have the ability at some point in their life to be able to do some of those things. So it needs to be a more streamlined process. I agree, and it's more efficient and more accessible to them. And just saying, I'm gonna send you a letter in the mail, that's not it.
When you're talking about, 1.7 million people, 1.8, somewhere in that range of people who are on Medicaid every year. So whether that number goes up or goes down, you're already talking about almost 2 million people that you have to communicate with on an annual basis. And so hopefully this will be a wake-up call to the state, because you don't want this to turn, like, to me, when I heard this, I was like, wow, it's totally different, but it has the undertones of what we heard in the 2018 election with voter registration. Oh, I didn't get my notice, or I didn't know that I was inactive, or I didn't know I was getting kicked off the rolls, all these things. Like, our state clearly has some sort of breakdown in either system management or informing the public that they need to take action on their own.
I think, and I'm glad you bring that point up about the purging and the notices of renewal for registration, voter registration. And part of the problem is, I think we are so committed to outdated practices here in this state that when it comes to human resource, when it comes to benefit management, when it comes to licensing, voter registration, how we operate at the state is very inefficient and it's very archaic. We're in 2019 and we're still having problems about transmitting data through systems. We don't communicate across departments on the state level. How does that translate into everyday life for the Georgia citizens, right? That has impact. Somebody who gets pulled over, they may have an outstanding warrant, but because of an unpaid ticket, but they actually paid the ticket, they still go to jail anyway, and then they lose, wages because of data transmission errors. And so I think we need to really have a good conversation and a more nuanced conversation in this state about how we are processing our information, data security. How do we manage our benefits for the citizens that are receiving them, and how we do it in a more effective, in a more time efficient and financially responsible way? Because this is costing people money. This is costing Georgia citizens and taxpayers money that we already don't have. We just don't have it. And so that's something I'm very much so looking forward to having as a conversation in the coming years.
Well, our next topic isn't really healthcare related, but it does kind of go along the same, I guess, premise. And so I'm going to give a little bit of background information, and then we'll go into the discussion about it. But basically, there was a judicial or a Supreme Court ruling from the state of Georgia earlier last week, and it was in the Tara Grinstead murder case. They had put the trial on hold because they were waiting for the Supreme Court to intervene based on some legal precedent. But basically, the gentleman who has been charged with malice murder, felony murder, aggravated assault, burglary, all of these things in the death of Tara Grinstead back in 2005, I believe. He was initially represented by a public defender down in Tifton because he was deemed unable to pay and indigent, and it wasn't until 2 Cobb County attorneys went down there, took over his case pro bono in August of last year, and they asked the court at that time to help with funding an investigator with expert witnesses and to help with some of the forensic evidence that the state has against them. So the judge down there ruled against them, said no, it's only for public defenders. And the public defender definition, I know I'm getting into a little bit of legal concern here, but I promise I will land the plane. The public defender definition says that it's someone who works for the judicial circuit, or someone who does or the public defender judicial circuit, or someone who does the duties of those people. So you don't, because there's often times when a judge will pull a private practice attorney from court and say, I want you to represent this person, and they have to do it as a public defender. So that's what happened. the attorneys for this man argued, yes, we are giving him legal services pro bono, but he can't afford to have the expert witnesses. And, you know, if he were represented by a public defender who was employed by the county or the judicial circuit, the state would cover those costs. And so their argument is that they are acting as a public defender, and so the cost should be covered. So I say all that to say, now the Supreme Court ruled and said that it's not their jurisdiction, and they sent it back down to the trial courts, urging the courts to make a different decision, because their argument is if a pro bono attorney comes in to represent somebody, regardless of the charges, whether it be a drug case or a murder or an armed robbery, if you have an attorney who cannot gather any evidence or have any experts testify or have any lab work done, you're going to have to try them again, because that person is going to appeal whatever, if they're convicted, they're going to appeal based on the fact that they had ineffective counsel and that the trial was flawed. But no one's ever challenged this before. So my question for you is, do you think that we need to change the law? And two, do you think that the state has a duty to pay for expert witnesses and supplementary trial expenses for somebody who is in private practice but is doing public defender work? And should we cap that so that we aren't just running up the tab, on every trial because the state's now the war chest?
Well, this is very when I saw this case, I was very interested and intrigued because of the series of appeals that were going back and forth between the Supreme Court and then the trial courts, and this is tough. And the reason why, because if you open this up and you say that if there is an indigent defense case or a defendant that is identified as an indigent defendant, and then gets a public defender, the public defender can, ask the court to give an increase in expense. But like you said, if it's a private attorney, then that's something totally different. But constitutionally, I don't know if that will be as problematic as it seems. Now, if we're going off of the context of, hey, we want to make sure we're being good fiduciaries for the state, I don't know if that would be something that we would be willing to see happen, because that is going to become expensive. However, on the back end of that, you're going to have a lot of appeals then, because they're going to say, in cases like this, well, we didn't get proper representation, as you see many times when there are capital cases and rape cases and things like that, when people have public defenders and then they don't get proper representation on that process. And so I think either way, the state is going to pay a lot of money, either on appeal, which is way more expensive. I would say, and I'm just looking at it, I don't have the preliminary numbers here as to how much the state has paid in recent years on appeals, or if they pay anything at all, right? But I don't know. I wouldn't be upset if this were to come through. Now, if it's private attorneys being paid and they're not pro bono, then I don't think we have a conversation, of course. But if they're pro bono attorneys who are working for an indigent defendant, then I don't see a problem with the state also having to foot that bill, because who else is going to pay for it? They're not going to get. We have to have a sense of judicial prowess, if you will, that allows for defendants to at least get the proper equal representation under the law. And if we're not willing to fund that process, whether it be expert witnesses, whether it be testing or examinations or anything like that, or even bringing forth witnesses, then that's not an equal representation.
So as a libertarian, it really creates a problem for me, because, you want as little government as possible. But then when you bring up the idea of a public defender, whether it's a private practice attorney, because even public defenders who work for the circuit have limited resources as to what they can dive into, and how much they can spend when they're doing supplemental things. But for this case in particular, and I said this, I wrote about this on All on Georgia, and this case in particular, the guy is a terrible poster boy for advocacy and for talking about this because, one, the case has been unsolved and unsettled for 14 years. The charges are hard for people to separate from the actual concept. I mean, this is, and it's a legal thing that most people in their lives won't have to deal with. But the libertarian in me is so bothered by the way that our judicial system works and the way that the courts railroad people and put them in jail. And obviously the utopia solution is to say, well, if we weren't spending so much money on the prosecution side and the public defender side on nonviolent crimes and minor offenses and crimes without victims, then there would be more money to fund things like this. I don't know what the right amount of money is to cap if you were to pay for a pro bono attorney who is acting as a public defender. But in my opinion, and I'm not a lawyer, but in my opinion, based on reading the law, which is pretty definitive, you don't have a public defender for any other reason because you're indigent. You're not indigent because you have a public defender. So anyone who is acting and representing someone who is indigent, that should have the same resources available to them that they would if they worked for the government. And so I don't know how you would calculate something like this. I guess there would be, ideally there would be maybe a sliding scale based on the type of offense and the average cost. And maybe you cap the state's resources on the same side.
Yeah.
And maybe that would limit the prosecution from doing ridiculous things and having doubled up witnesses and things like that. I don't know what the answer is, but wouldn't that cause a constitutional kind of challenge though? Because then if the state has the burden to prove, then you as a legislator or even a judicial voice, you're putting a cap on what the state can use as resources to defend its case. I don't know the case laws that are behind it because I'm not a lawyer either, but I would almost be certain that would cause some type of judicial crisis. And it may. Maybe the only way you can do it is by actually cutting funding to the circuits around the state in the first place. So that, if you can't legislate them, then what's the next best thing?
Yeah.
But, and that's obviously not the ideal solution. The ideal solution is to just treat people equally under the law. But I don't understand the Irwin County judge's perspective on this by denying the resources, because if he's convicted, they're going to ask for a new trial and it will be granted.
Right.
If there's no resources to prove. And the other thing is interesting. I understand in this case that the pro bono attorneys signed up to do it. They asked to help this man. But in a lot of cases, like I mentioned before, the judge pulls someone aside and says, hey, this guy needs a public defender. I'm going to have you represent him. He'll assign someone to them. If you're assigned by a judge as a private practice attorney, should you be required to foot the bill for expert witnesses because you were told to do something? Of course. That doesn't seem right either.
Yeah, that's not right. And I think, this is just a cynic in me. I think these attorneys actually took this case just for that very reason, to raise the question that, hey, we have this perfect opportunity to engage this blind spot in the law, in the statutes, and which is perfectly fine. But at the same time, maybe these attorneys who are in private practice, I don't know if they write those off at the end of the year, as businesses, as an expense, and they get, those tax credits back. So I don't know what the accounting is done, how that is done for their practices, but I know somebody's paying for it right now. And it hasn't been that burdensome that it hasn't come up before now, but I'm pretty sure that there is some type of IRS kind of credit that is given when you're funding these these cases as a private private practicing attorney, and like you said, you're pretty much told by the judge, hey, you're going to take this case. So
Right.
you can't, the state can't force you to pay for it, but what they can do is say, hey, you at least got to write it off on your taxes. So I'm pretty sure there's ways around it. But if that might be the best way to do it. Let's create a tax credit for attorneys who take cases pro bono. I don't know, something like that allows for them to at least get credit for it, and not have to have it come out of their bottom line or their profit.
Well, this is definitely one that's going to be interesting to watch, because I don't know why the attorneys took the case, and maybe I don't know how I feel about using somebody's, it's not like they're using to try to get it up to the Supreme Court. It's not like it's a negative impact. I mean, if anything, it bought their client some time.
Yeah.
And it seems to be for the right reasons. But what's interesting, and this is like most government, but the reason the state Supreme Court rejected it is because they didn't go through the proper processes, and the judge, the lower court judge, has to give them permission to move it up the ladder, which most lower court, right. And they did not do that. So I don't think this is the last we'll hear of this, and I kind of hope that it's a discussion point from the legislature, even if they don't act, just because they have a more captive audience than the judicial system as a whole. But yes. So one other little icebreaker that we're really harping on our issues for a long time here, but they're just so complex. There's so many different rabbit holes we can go down. But another story that came out this week was one out of DeKalb County. It's been an ongoing case since 2015, I think. 27-year-old Anthony Hill was shot and killed by a DeKalb police officer while he was in a PTSD episode naked. So he was unarmed and naked. Supposedly he charged the officer, and the officer shot and killed him. This week, a federal judge dismissed the civil rights claims against the county. I guess in DeKalb County, they have DeKalb County Sheriff and DeKalb County Police. They dismissed it against the county, saying that the police officer was adequately trained on use of force and interactions with mentally ill people based on best law enforcement practices, and therefore the family could not sue the county. They're still suing the officer, who's also standing charges for murder. I think his trial is supposed to start soon. But anyway, the county's not on the hook. So what are your thoughts on this one? Is the county to blame for something like this?
I don't know, and the only reason why is because it would be dependent on, the answer to that question would be dependent on what law is said to have been broken, or because we don't have civil rights laws here in Georgia, and so as far as the actual case itself, the concern I had was more so with and correct me if I'm wrong, but the county was not able to be sued or be held liable because it's a municipality within the sovereign state of Georgia. Is that correct? Well,
it's two prongs. You can sue for civil rights violations because it's federal court, and you're not asking for a change of anything. You're actually, I think they were suing for damages.
Okay.
But their allegations were that the policies that the DeKalb County Police put in place did not adequately train the officers, and that's why Olson was in a situation where he killed Anthony Hill.
Well, specifically, so for a civil claim, I would say that they should be held liable because he was mentally ill, and it obviously wasn't sufficient enough. And so to hold that officer who's acting in an official capacity, not an individual personal citizen capacity, but operating as an employee of the county, shoots and kills this 27-year-old man, they must be held liable for that. But of course, like you said, the federal courts ruled that you can't sue. They couldn't sue the county, but they can sue the individual.
Right. and I'm sure it's a wrongful death suit against Olson, but the judge said that the training on use of force and the interactions with mentally ill people follow the best law enforcement practices. Now, usually that comes from GPSTC, the Georgia Peace Officer Standards and Training Council. So when I read the article of this news initially, my first thought was, well, if you think that the standards are inadequate,
you should sue the
state
of
the
Georgia.
County is right, and you think that the county is required to abide by the state rules and regulations and standards, then you should sue the person who put the standards. I'm not advocating to be sue happy or that that's going to help this family in any capacity, but if that's, it's one of those few times where I could actually see why somebody else, if anyone, is responsible for this other than the person who actually did shoot and kill Anthony Hill.
But you see, so I understand their pushback, being a civil rights activist myself. However, I don't want us to get so litigious in the sense that we start challenging every standard that's in place. And so I know I might get pushback on that statement that I made, but how do you know? I get that the standard wasn't enough because this officer shot and killed this guy, but the standards weren't responsible for the boy being shot or the young man being shot. It was the officer that was responsible. And so the legal argument that suggests that because the standard was in place and it wasn't followed, that the standard and whoever processed through that standard should be held liable and responsible. I don't think that's a winning argument, and therefore that's why the court ruled the way it did. However, if we say this officer is responsible and did not do his duty as an officer, as a peace officer, to maintain and protect and all those, did he follow the proper procedures that were pushed out? If he didn't do so, you can't hold the standard responsible. You have to hold that individual. And so I can see why it came out the way it did. So suing the state of Georgia would not be a winning argument for me, in my estimation. However, I also don't think that we can just let them off the hook because he is operating in his official capacity. So to sue, and this again goes back to that question of sovereign immunity. I personally, and this is just a fundamental disagreement that I have, I personally don't think that the municipalities within a state should be immune from litigation. If they are responsible for something, in this case, I haven't looked at the details, but from just what I see, if they are responsible, if this man operating as a law enforcement official in his official capacity, DeKalb County should be held liable. Period.
Well, and going back to something that you touched on, one of the biggest concerns, you said you don't want to see people become so litigious that they just challenge standards and protocols everywhere they go. That's a really good point, because what we've seen in the past with government at the state, federal, and local levels, when something is challenged so many times, instead of making things better and more clear, we see the government roll back and make them more flexible so that their intention, no one could pinpoint an intention that they have, and there's more flexibility in their defense, if that makes sense. Like, you don't want to see standards relaxed to the point or so loose in a sense that nobody's responsible or that standards for these agencies decline.
Right. Because you need standards, and granted, I understand that the process of standardization within departments and institutions are very strenuous. It takes a lot out of people to come up with these things, to make sure they're implemented correctly, to train on them. But at the end of the day, standards are just that, standards. And people would not always oblige to those standards. And so there has to be a process that people are held accountable. And that process of accountability includes holding the entity that is responsible for employing said person who has caused this infraction of the standard, if they have not had some type of interdisciplinary action taken, which I'm sure they have in an investigation, all those things, but to bring some type of recourse publicly to the loss that was this man's life, they should be able to sue. And to tell their family that, hey, I'm sorry, you can't sue the department or the county because they're sovereign. I mean, they're immune, right? That's like saying a police officer is going, 80, 90, 100 miles an hour to a crime scene and hit somebody on the side of the road, and you tell them, well, you can't sue the county because of whatever damages that were created because of them acting in their official capacity. That still causes a disruption of public trust.
Well, and we've talked at length about sovereign immunity on this show. You're not going to get any pushback on that because the only way that you can sue at the state level or in what you're talking about is if you're given permission to do it, which is the most backwards and frightening aspect. I'm astounded that that's the practice and the way that it is. You should be able to sue your government whenever you see fit. And if a judge decides that it doesn't have any merit or that it should be thrown out, then so be it. We have a system in place for that already. But the legislature, we kind of touched on it on the last topic. The legislature shouldn't be meddling in that type of thing, but it's in our Constitution. So I do want to move on to our next topic, though, which is not Georgia related, but I'm sure there are some Georgia ties here. But we have offered a lot of opinions, so I just want to remind everyone, these are our opinions, not those of All on Georgia. We're just mouthing off as expert, opinionated people. But this week, Governor Kay Ivey of Alabama signed the chemical castration bill into law. So now, under their state law, anyone convicted of a sexual offense against a child under the age of 13 is required to begin taking medicine to reduce sexual desire, and which also makes them unable to perform sexual acts. If they're incarcerated, they have to begin taking it a month before they're released. And then the offender is responsible for all the costs, but they do have a clause in the bill that says if someone is unable to pay, if they're indigent, unable to pay, or if they're indigent, that's not a reason to keep them behind bars. They still have to be released. And then, of course, they can be sent back to prison if they intentionally end the treatment. And the court, it's an indefinite decision, and then the court will decide when you've had enough treatment or when you're, they believe you're mentally sound to handle this, whatever it is, without medication. So that's a lot to take in, that this is what government is focusing on. And I don't know, man, Alabama this session, they really did a number on civil liberties. So I'll let you comment first as the resident male here this week.
Hopefully I don't ever have to experience that. I don't plan to, but this is multi-layered. First, there's the ethical consideration of using non-consensual medical treatment, right? Like, what does that mean for our communities, our society, that governments are able to without consent, mandate that a person, regardless of infraction of the law, must change the way their body functions? That is very unethical, and I would say it's a human rights violation, because it brings me back to, say, the syphilis trials, right, in Alabama. Just right. Ironic, right? Like, what does that mean for the body? So, like, as a public theologian, me specifically, I'm focused on, in this particular bill or this law now, how this impacts our way of interaction and our engaging with the body as a public space, right? So if the government is able to tell an individual, hey, because you have broken the law, now I am in control of your body, that to me reflects a reality of slavery. Not necessarily saying that you're in chains, but the government now owns your body, right? And that becomes very problematic and traumatic for a number of reasons. Just because a person embraced the law does not mean they're less human. That shouldn't allow somebody, and that challenges the constitutionality of one of the United States' constitutional clauses that I won't get into on this specific conversation. But the other thing is, I'm very interested in the scientific aspect of it too. Like, what do they expect this to do? Is it going to create a situation where there's a recidivism, or are they hoping that this actually reduces that recidivism rate, that once somebody leaves prison, they will be less likely to commit another crime? There is no evidence that will support that, right? Like, But after somebody leaves prison, they should be allowed, and that goes even to the sexual registry, right? After somebody has completed their time, they should not be required to do anything else outside of the confines of what they were sentenced to do. They did their time, and that's it.
Well, there's 2 points that I know you have a lot of other issues that you want to go down, but I just want to mention 2 things. One, you're either safe enough to be released, or sound enough, or you can re-enter society, or you can't. So there's that. The other thing is that I don't even know how to articulate. I'll let you go on, but and I'll come back to my topic because I think you're going to get to it, and I don't want to step on your toes. But you're right. When you've completed your sentence, the sexual offender registry, that's a really touchy topic that I think we've covered a few times here. But that's what it was. You talked about the condition of your sentence and the standards under which you're sentenced. These people, this law is a blanket. So anyone in prison now, or who was in prison before last Monday, who is serving time for a crime against someone under 13, now is subject to this law, even though it wasn't their terms of their sentencing.
Which is unconstitutional.
Right. There's nothing in the law that says, this shall be going forward from the date of effectiveness or anything like that. There's no link. The bill is frighteningly short. I'm an advocate for short bills, but when you're talking about something like this, I think it's about a page and a couple sentences long. There's not a lot of detail. Basically just that you've got to take this and you've got to pay for it and you're going to like it.
And just to the point that you brought up about whether or not they're safe or not, if that isn't even a consideration, because the criminal justice system today is not designed to allow for rehabilitation and reentry. It's just not.
Right.
It's just saying, hey, we're going to set a sentence, a maximum or minimum, and we're going to let you out. We have not provided resources to rehabilitate within the criminal justice system in the penal institutions that these people are serving in, and we have not really addressed the conditions of these systems. And so when you literally walk inside of a prison, it's a hellhole. And so when we have an expectation that a drug is going to fix somebody who are mentally engaged in a place and inside of a space that literally produces recidivism just by its very nature. And so that aside, then we have to also deal with the fact that you brought some. What was the last part you brought up? Because you hit something on the head.
The retroactive nature?
Right. Right. The retroactive. So my question then becomes, who is this going to impact? And so as somebody who is very concerned with the state of the mass incarceration complex here in this country, this is going to primarily, and this is just for me, and it impacts other people, but I was going to go there. This is going to disproportionately affect people of color. Mm-hmm. I'm very concerned about that because the conditions of the African American community specifically, who makes up a majority of the penal institutions here in this country, right? That's going to disproportionately affect our community. And so I know this says anybody who is convicted of a sexual offense against a child under the age of 13. But I'm almost concerned that if this is put into law, which it already has been, this is not now going to open Pandora's box and say, okay, who's to say that now if you have committed a sexual offense against anybody under the age of 18, and then against anybody who's just committed a sexual offense against a person, period, and then, hey, if you're in jail, we're going to make sure you take this Kemp castration bill, or we're going to be able to do something that physically changes the way your body functions. That becomes very problematic for me, and I don't want us to see. I don't want to see us go down that pigeonhole, that rabbit hole that says the state is able to literally do whatever it wants to your body because now you are not a citizen nor a human being, but you are a property of the state. That is my concern about this bill.
And I was unaware. I mean, I've been following this bill through the Alabama legislature, but honestly, this is not something that I had really looked into a whole lot before it was signed into law, and I was not aware that Iowa, California, and Florida already have it for all sexual offenses, and that Guam, Iowa, or Louisiana, Montana, and Wisconsin have it for the 13 and under thing. But there's another aspect here, which is, I mean, you talked about people of color, but also men, just in men in general. They say that it's reversible, for the most part, of course, because nothing is an absolute. But they say that the effects are reversible if you stop taking the medication, which, by the way, is a cancer treatment that they use off-label by the FDA, which is hilarious in its own sense because we as Americans are discouraged and sometimes prohibited from using FDA drugs off-label, and we sure as heck can't use them off-label with insurance, but the government can, tell you that you can use something off-label because it suits their legislation and their interests. But aside from all of that, all you have to do is give them informed consent and tell them these are the risks and these are the dangers. And I'm assuming that's so that the state is not liable for anything that happens to you. But it's not as effective on women. It doesn't have the same impacts on the female body. And women, not to get too detailed here, but women on this medication can still engage in sexual acts. Like, there's the anatomy of the bodies are different, and men are having different effects. So from that perspective, I don't understand how any of these have held up in any type of court. Like, I'm baffled, truly. There's so many different angles here where it doesn't seem equitable under the law.
It's not equitable under the law. It's not equitable under the Constitution. The fact that this is a cancer drug that is not, allowed. I don't even know if this is allowed for normal people to just go out and buy, right? Like, just think about that. And I think about it from a financial sense as well. Like, say, for instance, these people are not able to pay for this drug, right? Who's going to pay for it? More likely the state is going to pay for it. Knowing how expensive cancer treatment is, I'm pretty sure this is a very expensive drug. And so it causes to question this concern of feasibility, affordability, even if they were to implement this. And so I don't think it should be implemented at all. But just purely from an economic standpoint, this is just insane.
Well, and it really makes you wonder how much a forethought was put into this, because the law requires that they begin taking it 1 month before they're released. How many people in prison for sex crimes do you know that have any money?
Right. Well, they got money now. Like, don't let them fool you. I got.
Well,
okay, but I get what you're saying.
Yeah, they don't even. I mean, if it's going to be based on prison labor or things like that, they better just start the day they get in there, because pennies on the dollar isn't going to pay for a month prescription of this. And then then what ends up happening is you're either going to require dependents or parents to pay for it, which is another whole other ethical issue, or they're going to be deemed indigent and they're going to be released without it until they can get a job, which totally, if that's the intention of the bill, is to have them take it, then how many people are actually going to be able to afford to take it while they're in prison? And
then let's talk about, we're going back to healthcare. If these people are taking drugs inside of the prison, what happens when there are adverse effects to this drug, which I'm pretty sure there are many, right? Like, you're changing whole hormonal processes within the body. You're changing how the mind operates, the psychological effects that it might have on one's person. Like, the prison system is not set up nor designed to actually address any of these issues. And so there's already a healthcare crisis within those prisons today. And you add this in there, it exacerbates that issue. You already don't have people who are able to afford it. So it's like, what are we doing? We're setting ourselves up to literally be sued to death. Like, Alabama really will be sued. It's like Georgia putting forth this heartbeat bill. We know we're about to get sued for this, but we're going to put it through anyway, right?
Right.
So it's just,
well, you bring up, I mean, if you ask anyone who supported the heartbeat bill, their argument is it's a fight worth fighting, and I'm okay with my tax dollars being used for it. It's similar in this case, because the sponsor of this bill, I can't remember his first name, but I believe his last name was Hurst. Yeah, Steve Hurst. He was all in for this bill, and this was the watered down version. He had another bill that would have required the offender to pay for physical castration upon release, which again, talking about the male and female aspect, how are you going to I can't even comprehend on a physical level what that would entail and the costs associated with that. But that didn't get out of committee, thank goodness. But this guy was truly all in for this concept. And I mean, I can't wait to see him put it on a mailer because.
But then what about.
How do you explain that?
And there are two last things I want to hit on this. One, the law doesn't necessarily address before they even get out, right? It just says anybody who's convicted has to take this medicine to reduce their sexual desires. What about people who are wrongfully convicted?
Mm-hmm.
And what about people who will be in like, personally, my father he wasn't convicted of a sexual offense against a child under 13, but he's convicted of a sexual offense nonetheless. He has life sentences. What about those persons as well? Under this bill, it might not affect them, but I'm pretty sure if this goes into law, which it did, then they expand it. Those persons who are in jail or in prison for the rest of their life will also very well may be able to take it. I mean, may be forced to take it. How does that impact them? Even though they're incarcerated, even though they are prisoners, they still have human rights as well. And we cannot afford in this country to continue to do business as we've done it. People who are behind bars, they just... Go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, I know you know this, and we're getting close to the end of the show, but I mean, this is one of the hardest conversations to have in public, with the public, amongst the public. Like, people are ruthless against inmates, and I understand. I mean, they have committed some atrocious crimes that people can't even comprehend or understand, like the damages they do. Nobody is disputing that. But we live in our justice system is deemed the best in the world because we don't have inhumane things and we don't have these government overreaches just because somebody has been convicted of a crime. Like, we are very careful in what we restrict once somebody is convicted of something because we know the system is flawed. Even though it may be the best in the world, it is flawed, and people go to prison every single day because of for a crime they didn't commit.
Right.
It's frightening, but
and unconstitutional.
You think?
Yes, unusual. And what's the Eighth Amendment? I can't remember what the word of it is, but cruel and unusual punishment. There you go.
You think it will be challenged?
Oh, I know it will be challenged. ACLU, if nobody else is working, I know the ACLU is working to. If they haven't already filed a motion for injunctive relief, I know they will be soon.
I'm interested in, like I said, we're coming to the close here, but I really want to do some research on court cases in all of I think there's 7 other states. I mean, I just have a hard time believing that nobody would stand up and challenge something. Obviously, it's not gotten to the Supreme Court, but if this is one of those that should.
Right.
Well, we have talked about so many issues, and I feel like we could go on for another hour or two because we never have a shortage of things to spout off about. We are both good talkers about these types of issues. But any closing thoughts, any issues that you want people to be aware of that you've kind of been covering or following in what you do on a day-to-day basis?
I'm just very, and I'll just say this in closing, I'm very frustrated at the congressional Democrats right now. And it's not even on the merit of impeachment of Trump. Like, I'm not really concerned. I am concerned about that, but I'm not concerned about that. What I am concerned about, though, is that people are putting their bets on 2020 on people in leadership that has not committed to doing their job today. And I'm very much so tired of seeing Democrats talk about Donald Trump and, throw him under the bus in every way, shape, and form, and rightly so. But if you, as a congressional Democrat, say Trump is doing X, Y, and Z, and it's illegal, and all those things, do your job. Start the articles of impeachment. push it through the House, right? Like, I just don't get it. Like, Nancy Pelosi tweeting every day something about Trump said this or that. I don't care. Like, if they're not going to do their job and impeach him, then shut up. That's how I feel. Like, shut up, because I don't want to keep hearing. Like, we got a Sudanese civil war basically breaking out right now, and the media is talking about what what tree died that was supposed to represent Trump and France's president's relationship. I don't care about that, right? Like, if you're gonna do something, do it. And if you're not, just go.
Well, I feel like that commentary is bait, and if I start, I'm not gonna stop. And our show this week is over, so thank you all for listening. Thank you for joining us, James. It was awesome to have you on. Hope you'll be back when Dave is back at some point. And everyone, make sure you rate us on social media on your favorite podcast platforms, and we will talk to you next week.